everybody. I want to welcome you to another episode, an installment for this channel regarding politics, public policy, and international relations. My name is Joseph Lugo. We're going to tackle a topic today that's complicated, many more factors involved. It's something that is a realistic application of the kind of concepts that we talked about in the last episode, that of mass shootings. So in the wake of shootings in Buffalo, New York, and Uvalde, Texas, there was another one on July 4th in Highland Park, Illinois. And as I just mentioned, this is exactly the kind of issue that is a real-world application for leaders and citizens alike for the concepts that we've talked about in the last episode regarding democracy. A maximization or balance of freedom versus the rule of law. We'll talk about the factors involved. We'll talk about the state of the issue. And we'll talk about what has been done, what is being done, and perhaps the ideas that are currently out in debate regarding what more can be done. I think the overarching myth for an issue like this is when you get into what I call the soundbite policy, the soundbite proposals. And they really love to focus in on one factor, whether you're talking about guns alone or whether you're talking about mental illness alone, when that actually applies, which is rare. But it is a factor at times. Or when you're talking about any other single concept, such as school security, or anything else. Interest groups and our current leadership love to focus on one thing and make that somewhat the clarion call, the rallying cry to bring people to an issue. It may or may not work, but it's important to know that an issue like this has many factors involved, many factors correlating with incidents that contribute to mass shootings. Now, obviously, we all understand that some factors are more important than others, but we simply cannot focus on one factor and expect the problem to be solved, particularly in the way this democracy operates, which calls for effective action. Effective action would be something that would be comprehensive, that would address the issue as it is and attempt to move in the right direction in resolving it, which means you can't simply focus on one issue, which also carries the danger of over-politicization and ensures that any proposal that you put forth will likely be unsuccessful. So let's talk about the state of affairs in this moment. What is a mass shooter? So this is an important question, and it is not exactly specific. There are times on certain kinds of criminals, certain kinds of issues where we can define a specific list of traits, of factors, and of symptoms or displayed behaviors that we could point to. And I would submit in this case that we don't have a specific list, but I do believe that there are some broad concepts that as time moves forward, we will be able to kind of hone in on these and be able to slowly get a more clear picture of what contributes on the personal level to someone who is a danger to themselves and others. So this is an article from NPR. We're going to devote an entire episode to sources later. I want to briefly touch on that right now. It's important to know that regardless of the bias that we feel certain sources have, whether that's right or left, NPR, Fox News, Wall Street Journal, or anything else, we're looking for accurate information and information that may be constructive to our purpose. So while we may have a certain feeling for the overall bias of a source and can probably in some cases verify that that's correct, when we're talking about specific pieces of information, we want to emphasize that if we verify it, or if it's something that is based in study or some sort of accuracy, then we can take pieces of information and describe them as accurate or describe them as helpful in an issue. This is an article from NPR from about 4 days ago talking about the Highland Park suspect. So I want to come down here and talk about this. We're going to focus just on this one in regards to, individual factors, but it's something that if you research a number of mass shooters, you're going to find perhaps not necessarily the exact same list, but you're going to find concepts that match, concepts that correlate to each other. So, and I'm just going to highlight certain paragraphs here and go through them. Instead, many experts on extremism and technology say this suspect activity fits with still emerging profile of mass shooter. Rather than falling neatly into categories familiar to law enforcement and the public, such as white supremacists, radical Islamists, or anti-government militants, it requires an understanding of dark online subcultures that overlap and feed into each other in ways that glorify violence and foster nihilism. Alarmingly, these experts say these online milieus have been tied to an increasing number of mass shootings over time. What this is going to go through is a convergence of individual action and online community. Now, there will be the debate, is the joining of online community and expression of the individual, or is there a feedback loop with regards to the influence of these communities on the individual? Probably both to some degree are true. I'm not going to get in that conceptual debate right now, but the function of the understanding of both of these factors are going to help us understand a mass shooter. So that's the important part right now. And this is from Odette Youssef. So I'm going to give her credit as well on this, and we'll be posting that in the description. So in addition to the involvement of online communities, some of the other examples that we see, particularly what we see with the Uvalde shooter, is also an increase of threats as well as actions or violent actions towards others. And these increase in severity and also can increase in number as time goes on. So you won't find a specific profile for a mass shooter, but there are sets of patterns. And we just talked about the Illinois shooter and briefly referenced the Uvalde shooter regarding behaviors. But if you go through a number of these profiles of mass shooters, you begin to see overarching patterns that are in common. So we see posts of weapons and violence, multiple threats of violence, and or assaults to others, perhaps cruelty to animals in some of these cases. Online activity enforcing violent ideas and behavior. And what seems to be all the actions all seem to be tied to an overarching pattern of the ideation and idealization of criminal violence for notoriety, for attention, or to solve one's problems. Now, these behaviors may or may not be associated with a radical ideology, such as white supremacy or radical Islamism or any other extremism on any of the political spectrum, which it could be the left as well. So, or it could be what they express as left-wing extremism. So that's possible, but not always exactly the case. So we talk about these kinds of online political ideologies, and They can be connected, but they don't always have to be. It could be simply an expression of violence, an expression of revenge, an expression of violence as the answer to somebody's problems, or the pathway to notoriety and attention. So, in addressing kind of this situation of who a mass shooter is, so then we get to the problems of what do we do. And the article that I was just showing actually briefly, it actually touches on that, the issue of action, the problem that the debate that is had as far as what is acceptable regarding free speech and what is acceptable to protect the public. So in doing that, we have to come to an understanding again of the Constitution as not just an edict, not just a word-for-word document that can only be taken at its words and no more than that. Because we have its background, we have its history, we have those who created it arguing its concepts, and the idea, even from the very beginning of this country, that there would be a balance between protection of citizens and the freedoms of their freedoms. Indeed, that has been, the debate since the Constitution was implemented. Now, we haven't always got that balance correct, but it does exist, and there are times when people may look at a situation in our history and say that's excessive, but it was also legal and constitutional and necessary to protect the public. So it's a mix, like anything else, when we look at particular examples. So in doing that, we want to talk about what has been done recently. And in doing that, we refer to the bill that was recently passed, called the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. So this bill was just recently passed, and one could regard it as a step in the right direction regarding this issue, because it doesn't just hone in on one issue. It does look at the problem as a whole, as a complex whole. Now, the question will be, is it enough? And inevitably, it's possible that more will need to be done to address this problem, despite the bill that was passed. We're going to go through briefly what it accomplishes. First, it includes 18 to 21-year-olds in background checks. So if there's an issue, if there has been certain kinds of crimes committed by an individual of that age range, it will be recorded and it will be revealed in a background check. So that's helpful. In addition to that, it promotes the state's usage of red flag laws, or gives incentives for states to use red flag laws. Red flag laws are the ability of government to temporarily remove guns from the possession of an individual who may be deemed a danger to themselves or others. Now, of course, there is a debate regarding that in regards to the 14th Amendment and the due process clause of that amendment, which states, I'm paraphrasing, but it states that no rights may be taken away without due process of law. The debate is not necessarily whether there should or should not be due process in a situation. Of course, when we come across all these complicated issues, the debate becomes what kind of due process, how much due process in a situation like this. The issue is, the Supreme Court has come out with a couple of cases, and regarding that, I will post those in the description. I'm going to briefly just talk about the concepts. Basically, that you can't standardize the due process. You can't standardize due process because there's no standardization of crimes. There's no standardization of what a danger is to society, and therefore is impossible to standardize due process. Due process then inherently is situational. And due process, therefore, can inherently be situational and still be constitutional if it meets certain requirements and within certain situations. Now, if you're talking about somebody who's a danger to themselves or others, obviously no crime has been committed, but we are trying to measure that danger. And typically, it happens all the time when we talk about children being removed from a home, or if we're talking about a civil protection order being placed on somebody to stay away from another individual. That is done through the process of hearings. It's done through the process of a hearing before a judge with the introduction of contradictory evidence and testimony to determine whether it's valid. That's sufficient due process for an individual for those kinds of situations. And that's exactly the kind of measurements that are being used for red flag laws. So likely what you're going to see as that gets hashed out, and it will be hashed out probably very explicitly and specifically, so that there will be these kinds of hearings and those kinds of the opportunity for contradictory evidence and testimony in those situations. But it is a step in the right direction in that it is promoting the ability of states to implement those laws for the protection of the public. This bill also closes the boyfriend loophole, which simply enables anyone who's been anyone, regardless of the situation of the victim, whether the victim lived with them or not. It enables those who have committed crimes of domestic violence for those crimes to be recorded and shown on a background check, and also allows them to not obtain firearms. It also funds school security and crisis intervention. Now, again, this is another balancing act. There are those who will argue, one side or the other, that we can make schools fortresses, and that will be, sufficient. Others will say that we don't want to distress the students in any way. And of course, that is going to have to be, the nature of this bill is inevitably going to give funds for schools to determine crisis intervention in schools when we're talking about prevention of school shootings, not necessarily mass shootings overall, but when we're talking about the prevention of school shootings, it's going to allow the funding for staff to intervene in situations for certain students. When we're talking about exactly the kinds of things that we were talking about in the article earlier, if we're seeing those patterns in students. And also for security. And now I wholly support more numbers of police, fencing, more security, anything that would enhance the security of schools. That is also, however, inherently situational, depending on the state and the situation, as the way things stand right now anyway, and the nature of this bill. And I think there is a balancing act here as well. So what is left to be done? What does this bill fall short? Where does this bill fall short, and what is left to be done? So currently we face a situation where a number of laws already exist and have existed regarding background checks with a failure of enforcement. And what we have seen is the inability of these laws to be enforced in order to protect the public. I believe that has been the case with mass shooters. I think it is the case with I think one of these current ones, one of these recent ones in which we see, shooters falling through the cracks of background checks and whatnot. Particularly when you're talking about 18 to 20-year-olds, the issue often is that there's simply no crime committed yet, and at least no crime on the books. But after the fact, what we see is, domestic issues, domestic assaults, really, that don't end up actually, where individuals don't actually end up being charged, and these kinds of patterns that we see. So the question will inevitably be, what kind of tools does law enforcement and our leadership need in order to tackle this situation? So inevitably, we're going to have to see, likely, if this situation continues and continues to get worse, national, state, and local law enforcement will need to be working more closely with online platforms to discover these kinds of behaviors, to find them, to flag them out, and to act on them. And what we may end up debating, likely, in my opinion, is while we are determined to discover the patterns that have been described, we're also going to have to perhaps give law enforcement and other leadership the kind of tools that they have in anti-terrorism. And we may eventually, if cooperation doesn't work, if the rules that we already passed have fallen short, then we're probably going to have to come to that point and debate those issues. Now, there is obviously, again, another debate stating that this is illegal, this is unconstitutional, and clearly what describes constitutionality is obviously not something that is standardized. It is something that, yes, that no, you cannot step outside the Constitution, that there are explicit rules that you cannot step over, but there's also a due process clause. And when we come to the point of that concept, we realize, based on history, based on the background of the Constitution and the background of that particular amendment, the 14th Amendment, that sufficient due process, not black and white due process, but sufficient due process is situational. That if something has sufficient due process, as well as proper process behind it, that it is acceptable, it is constitutional, it is legal. And we're going to have to debate that as a people, and we're going to have to debate that amongst our leaders, the leaders that we elect. They're going to have to face hard choices, and we are going to have to elect leaders who are willing to face those hard choices, especially if what we have done is not enough. Then we're going to have to do two things. One, figure out how we better enforce laws that are on the books, step one, and then step two, if that is not enough, figure out what more we need to do. Exactly, and at that point we will have to address exactly the things that are mentioned here regarding due process, regarding the tools for law enforcement and other leadership in this country. So in doing that, the other thing that we're going to have to come to terms with, to come to grips with, that goes beyond any law or rule, is the coordination of law enforcement and leadership regarding policy and procedure for mass shooting. Now, it's extremely important that as we move on in dealing with this information, that we need to have it, from everyone, from those who enforce the law and risk their lives every day, all the way up to legislatures, governors, and the national government as well, coordinating policy regarding mass shootings, that we're all on the same page, and that when incidents occur, that communication can be effective in minimizing the loss of life. This is a report regarding the Robb Elementary School attack, the Uvalde shooting. And it's a report that is essentially an assessment of the actions taken that day and also a timeline of the events that occurred. So let me go through this before you think that this is simply a crackpot attempt to malign law enforcement. I want to state that, regardless of the situation, first of all, that, they put their lives on the line every day, and their sacrifice is always noble. But I also believe that it would not be helpful. I think it is helpful to analyze the actions of that day and the mistakes that were made. Frankly, I wouldn't. What hasn't been talked about enough is the mistakes of legislature, state legislatures and the governor, the government of Texas, and what may or may not could have been done, what more laws they could have passed, what more they could have done to promote communication. So everybody's accountable. And in talking about what law enforcement did that day, I want to emphasize as well that what's not being talked about is, everyone from the top down in the state of Texas who should also be held accountable for what was not done, not just on the day, but before that day. So, but in this report, let me also give you the credibility of the writers of the report here to let you know that they know what they're talking about. Now, the Texas Department of Public Safety contacted the Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training Alert Center soon after the attack to access the law enforcement response. The Alert Center was selected for this task for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, Alert is nationally recognized as the preeminent active shooter/attack response training provider in the nation. Alert was recognized as the national standard in active shooter response training by the FBI in 2013. Alert's excellence in training was recognized in 2016 with a Congressional Achievement Award. So these people are at the forefront of analyzing policy and procedure with regards to mass shootings. And this goes through, I'm not going to go through this, but it goes through their methods. And so they're going to evaluate specific response tactics and the history as well. And then the next paragraph here on page 17. As discussed, the situation became static at 11:38:37. Prior to this, at 11:38:11, the UCI SD PD chief called for additional assistance. The responding tactical teams and equipment. The responding officers began treating the situation as a hostage/barricade rather than an active shooter event. The timeline shows that the shooter was killed at 12:50:03. This section will describe the escalating circumstances that unraveled over 1 hour, 11 minutes, and 26 seconds between officers taking static positions and the moment the suspect was killed. We will detail key moments where officers' capabilities increased due to arriving equipment and personnel, as well as moments where the exigency of the situation increased due to either suspect actions or additional information. So we're not going to go into all those specifics, but the report will be available for you to look at. And so the report continues to go on at where it basically says at multiple points there are opportunities for officers to engage, and contrary and as they investigate, they find that officers did gain some equipment as time went on, and they state it still took an hour to engage. So again, this is not simply to malign law enforcement. It could be very possible that if they had done even less, or if something else had happened, that it could be even worse than it was. But as it stands, clearly the report states that not enough was done, and that there was confusion, and that there was not a sufficient leadership in that situation to figure out exactly how to address it. Now, again, I have to emphasize that this is talking about the law enforcement end of it. There really should be analysis, a breakdown, and a report of political leadership in Texas and in other states who should be held accountable for what was or was not done, the laws that were implemented, as well as laws not passed, in addition to the fact that they are also, as civilian leadership, responsible for ensuring and promoting coordination and communication in these types of events, not just within police departments, but with police departments and other officials. So everyone's accountable here. But I think the report is very important in emphasizing that there has been a certain procedure regarding active shooters, regarding mass shootings from the time of Columbine, and it is time that everyone be held accountable regarding the implementation of those procedures, both political and otherwise. So we've seen the analysis of national leadership, what they have and have not done. Eventually, if this continues to worsen, it's a situation where there will be calls for action on the national level, not just to promote certain solutions, but to actually act from the national level. That may be possible. That is something that it may come to if things continue as they are, if rules have continued to not be enforced, if coordination and communication continues to be lacking. It's something that, in a perfect world, we would wish to avoid. As Abraham Lincoln said, if all men were angels, no government would be necessary. And we have to implement that in a relative spectrum when it comes to, an issue that directly threatens children and the American public in a domestic way like this does. And we may yet be talking more about more solutions in the future. So we've talked about the national level, we've talked about the state and local level. Now, obviously, we live in a country where we have to address the individual responsibility of all of us. And I've referred to the patterns of mass shooters, the patterns of their behavior. One can obviously argue that, hey, there are plenty of people who have these factors and they're not mad. They don't become mass shooters. They just have, problems here and there. And to some degree, that's correct. But I would also argue when you're talking about multiple incidents that increase in escalation and frequency, as well as isolation that continues to worsen, threats of violence among family members and among friends that continue to worsen, erratic behavior that continues to worsen. We begin to not just talk about infrequent, occasional incidents that may be a phase. We begin to see a total pattern of behavior that makes a person a risk to themselves, to others, and to their community. And it really is the responsibility of all of us, including me and everyone who calls himself American, to really think about difficult decisions regarding people who exhibit this kind of behavior and what to do about it. The problem is that the laws are we're talking about laws that are very loose. A situation where somebody can simply say they're not, particularly after a domestic incident or after an assault or anything like that, where officers are questioning a suspect and somebody can simply say, I'm not a threat. And that's enough for them to be left alone. And again, it's another situation where debates may have to be had if people continue to fall through the cracks in those situations. And again, realizing that each of us has a responsibility to report, to call tips in, if they see something online, to take the necessary action to the appropriate law enforcement entity. And I think that we all have to, all of us, myself, that I have to look in the mirror, look at what I see around me at times and wonder if I see something around me at times and wonder how much more action I need to take. So that addresses each level of action, each level of the situation. And it's an issue that's obviously complex, and it's an issue that we may very well have to make some serious and difficult decisions on, much more difficult than the ones that we've made now if things continue. But that's always been the nature of leadership. It's always been the nature of the protection of citizens. And that's, as we mentioned, it falls right back onto the episode that was posted, the last episode that was posted, that's government's role. One of its first roles is to protect its people within the bounds of the law. But that law is not static. It's not necessarily relative. It's not, I don't necessarily agree with the concept of a living constitution. It is set, but it is contextual. It's a three-dimensional document with history and background that, we have to understand that situations are dynamic. So the Constitution must be applied dynamically without breaking it. So that concludes this episode. And I hope that I've engendered debate on the issue. And I've stated some of the more concrete factors of the situation, but I've also kind of imparted to you, or talked about some of the situations that are continuing to be debated, the factors in that debate. And it's not set in stone yet, but we may very well have to address some very complicated decisions about it. So I thank you for your time, and hopefully the information that has been, expressed here, if you want to discuss that, you're free to leave comments in the video on YouTube. And I hope that you will like and subscribe those videos and comment as well. And hopefully we start debates, or at least start discussion toward better action on this issue. Thank you.